This video is going to go through the idea of juxtaposition and then go through the poems that are related to it as well, because the slideshow is very short. The basic idea of juxtaposition is that you are putting two things next to each other in a poem that are usually quite different from each other, and you're doing it to compare them. Okay, so that is basically what it says here: when two unlike topics or images are placed next to each other for comparison. Okay, this might seem a little bit confusing, but it's really not complicated. You just have two things that are being talked about right next to each other. They're very different from each other. Okay, so we look at this passage on the right from Charles Dickens. This is one example of juxtaposition that's pretty famous that people talk about a lot. So it's going to compare two different locations. Okay, so it says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. In this case, these two places where it's the best of times in one and the worst of times in the other, where people are wise in one, foolish in the other, are clearly very different from each other, and they're being put right next to each other to emphasize this. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. Okay, so like I said, we have these two places, one where people are going all the way or directly to heaven, one where people are obviously going to hell, one where it's the season of light, one where it's the season of darkness. They're very different from each other, and that's what the author wants to emphasize. Okay. So our first poem that we're going to look at is called The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. This actually has three things that are being set up next to each other, being juxtaposed. Okay, but I'll read through it first, then we'll talk about that. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger Sea. With a shower of rain, we stopped in the colonnade, and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten, and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Okay, so some of this might be a little bit confusing, but you might notice that the basic structure of this is that we talk about April here, we talk about winter here, and we talk about summer here. Those are the three things that are being juxtaposed. Okay, April, winter, and summer. And the purpose of it is to focus on how awful April is. It says April is the cruelest month. Okay, and it gives these reasons. But then it says, by comparison, winter kept us warm. It did these wonderful things. Summer surprised us. Okay, that's usually a positive thing. People were able to go off in sunlight. They were able to drink coffee and just talk for an hour. But then we have April, which is this cruel month. So all of this is to emphasize how awful April truly is. In this poem, we also have good examples of personification, going back to an older literary term that we covered. So we have winter keeping us warm. Okay. We have forgetful snow. We have summer surprising us. All of those are really good examples of personification where objects or things are being treated like they're humans. Okay, because snow is not normally forgetful. Winter doesn't actually actively do anything usually. Summer doesn't actively do anything like surprising us. Those are things usually that people do. Okay. This next poem is called Some Days by Billy Collins. Okay, it's going to set up a juxtaposition between two different types of days that he has. Okay, so the two things being juxtaposed in this poem are two different kinds of days. Some days, I put the people in their places at the table, bend their legs at the knees if they come with that feature, and fix them into the tiny wooden chairs. All afternoon they face one another, the man in the brown suit, the woman in the blue dress, perfectly motionless, perfectly behaved. So one day, or some days, he is basically in control of everything. But other days, I am the one who's lifted up by the ribs and then lowered into the dining room of a dollhouse to sit with the others at the long table. Very funny, but how would you like it if you never knew from one day to the next if you're going to spend it striding around like a vivid god, your shoulders in the clouds, or sitting down there amidst the wallpaper, staring straight ahead with your little plastic face? It's a pretty cynical or negative poem. But once again, the two things that are being juxtaposed are days where he has control and days where he does not have control over things. Okay, so represent those days where he actually has control over his life. He is actually controlling the life of other people. He uses the simile of striding around like a vivid god, so like a vivid god. Okay, like a god would even be fine for the simile here. Because think of it like a child controlling dolls in their playhouse. Okay, they are able to do with them whatever they would like. So that's how he feels some days. But then other days he feels like the doll in the playhouse. Okay, so it says staring straight ahead with your little plastic face. He's lowered into a dining room of a dollhouse. So the metaphor, even though it's not really clear in here, the metaphor is that he is nothing but a doll on those days, like a plastic doll. Okay, so it represents the days where he has no control. He is just a plastic doll. This poem isn't quite as clear of an example of juxtaposition, but we'll talk about we'll talk about how it kind of works after I read through it. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now, with your fierce tears I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Okay, so the two things that are being juxtaposed, we have the good night. Okay, so a quiet, peaceful night, and this would represent death in this poem, if that wasn't clear. But the good night is one thing, and then it's being juxtaposed with fighting against it. Okay, so a very calm, peaceful night, and then raging against it. Those two things are being juxtaposed. So the peacefulness of night, and then the struggle, the rage against it. Okay, so the metaphor that's being repeated throughout this is do not go gentle into that good night, which basically means do not die without a fight. Okay, that good night is death. So for the metaphor, you could put down that the good night means death, but the basic idea is that he doesn't think that people should just give in to death and go peacefully. They should fight against it. They should try to stay alive as hard as they can. Okay, you might notice at the end it says, and you, my father, there on the sad height. He's saying, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So once again, we see him telling somebody not to give in, to fight against death. But in this case, we find out that it's his father, so he's begging his father to stay alive at this moment. So the author is claiming that at the end of our life, we should fight against it. We should try to stay alive as long as possible. We should fight against death. Okay. The last one might be familiar to you. A lot of people quote this kind of incorrectly when they're talking about it. But this is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Okay, so we'll read through it and then talk through what's being juxtaposed and what this poem actually means. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps a better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though it was for that the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, in knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Okay, So the two things that are being juxtaposed, hopefully this was kind of clear, that there are two roads, so two paths that he could take. So that's what's being juxtaposed here, the two paths. So he looks down one as far to where it bent in the undergrowth and then took the other. Because it was grassier, it wanted where, like not as many people had walked down this path. Okay. And many people do take this poem to mean by the end that it makes sense to take the road less traveled by, like do something that other people are not doing, be adventurous, be bold, that type of thing. So take the path that fewer people take in life. That's kind of how people usually interpret this, and how it usually gets quoted. Okay, and saying that that's going to be meaningful in their life. However, you can also imagine this poem being quite sarcastic, right? You can think about people making a decision when they're 15, and then when they get to be 30, they tie everything back to that one decision, saying that, oh, everything that I've done is just because I took that one path that was less traveled by. Okay, and he's saying that's kind of ridiculous. This person doesn't know what would have happened from that other path. That's actually the point of the stanzas. He's never going to go back and see what the other way would lead to. But then he's going to be proud of it later on and say, oh, that's what made all the difference, taking that one path, making that one decision earlier on. So it's actually meant to be pretty sarcastic here at the end. So the actual meaning of this poem is that basically we try to put importance on things that really don't matter. Okay, so we try to make things seem important when they sometimes do not matter. Okay, or it could even be taking it a little further, that life is not as predictable as we might think it is. Okay, so that is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost.